their service in return. But obviously, getting back to the first trend that we talked about, all this needs to be done in the context of strengthening and heightening security. So when you think of client experience, you often think of ease of doing business and convenience of getting a lot of data arriving on your mobile phone, for example. Well, that's very much user-friendly, but it also sometimes comes with limited security. And finding that right balance between the user-friendliness and the security is something that a lot of the advisors we work with try to strike that right balance. So how has the Fox community, the members that we support, responded to this? We've seen on the advisor side, firms create executive positions focused on the client experience. Some firms have now a managing director or a client experience chief officer. We're seeing firms create a client advisory council to have a sounding board representing their clients to serve as an advisory board and tell them how their services are being perceived and how they can improve the experience. And more of the advisors that we work with conduct systematic client surveys. Some of them are very quantitative, others are more qualitative, but really trying to understand what is it that their clients are telling us as opposed to trying to project what it is that they may like. So a few questions for you to think about with respect to your businesses. How are families changing their requirements in terms of client experience? What are they looking for or maybe saying that they weren't saying in the past? How are you changing your service models in response to that? And how much work have you done in not even talking about changing the client experience, but understanding what it is today, even mapping out your current client experience? And we're finding that some of the organizations that we work with don't even really know the current state. They'd like to improve it, but they don't really have a full understanding of what their client experience is today. And that's obviously where things start. So let's move to the third trend, which is the fact that single family offices are continuing to explore outsourcing. So when Fox got started in 1989 and a family had a significant liquidity event in the US, let's say north of 100 million, probably 9 out of 10 of those families would set up a single family office. And they would set up a single family office that was really a full service office, doing everything from tax to estate planning to bill pay, wealth management. And that was primarily because there weren't that many other solutions out there for a family with that level of wealth. Multi-family offices didn't really exist. There were private banks, but they were selling products primarily. There was not really an environment where you could go to for advice. So families built their own. Today, that number is much lower. It's probably 3 out of 10 families that set up a single full-service, single-family office in this context. What we're seeing a lot more, though, is hybrid models where families will do some things in-house because they want to control them, because they want to customize them, because they want to keep them very confidential, and then outsource other services to an ecosystem of advisors, which is now quite robust and a lot more open to working with single-family offices. So you're seeing this in the family offices that we serve. We've asked them in our recent benchmarking what services are being outsourced. And 75% replied integrated planning, 65% investment planning, and 57% accounting, reporting, and compliance. So obviously what tends to be outsourced are the things that are usually more complex, where having a critical mass to provide the services and attract the talent is critical, especially on the investment side, where unless you have very significant wealth, being able to afford and attract a very competent chief investment officer, for example, is challenging, and it's easier to share with other families in a multi-family office setting or with an investment consultant, for example. And what we're seeing also on the other side, on the advisor side, is more of the multi-family offices are open to working with single-family offices. In the past, it used to be really one or the other, in the sense that most multifamily offices would say that they could only work with a family if they did everything for them, and especially if they had the investment piece and the asset under management, because that's really the only way they knew how to get paid. And then the other services that they provided were often actually provided for free at no extra charge, because the model was that the multifamily office would generate revenue on the basis of the asset under management. That model has evolved because I think a lot of the MFOs found that it wasn't really a healthy model where you make money on some services and give the others away for free. You end up having some services that subsidize others, and also you end up having some clients that subsidize others. Those that use less of the services are actually getting more value and being subsidized by those that use less. So the MFO model has evolved significantly over the past 10 years, and now most of them offer a broad range of services and a different pricing model depending on what you want to do with them. And see it as, you know, multiple doors of entry where you can come in for the investment piece, but you can also come in for tax or estate planning or bill pay. And depending on what you want, you may pay basis points on the asset under management, but you also may pay a retainer, a flat fee, or an hourly fee. And that has created an environment where the synergies between the two are a lot easier to find. So more evidence of outsourcing, especially on the investment side, because as I mentioned before, that's where a lot of the complexity lies. In our global investment survey, we learned that 2/3 of the single family offices that we work with partner with external investment consultants. That number has gone up year after year, and it's now at 66%, which is a significant outsourcing level. And then we also ask our members more specifically what types of services that we're getting from investment consultants. And 88% replied strategic asset allocation, and that's also driven by the complexity. 78% manager selection, 75% client reporting and performance. So those top three are really, you know, not surprising and to be expected. The last two are a bit more surprising. 31% said education materials and seminars. So really turning to those consultants to help them educate the family and very often educate the next generation and make them, you know, more aware so they can become better buyers of services and products. And 9% outsource the full service outsourced CIO function. So the line of demarcation between single family offices and multifamily offices that a lot of people saw for many years is starting to blur, and those two worlds are starting to come much closer and collaborate much more often. So how has the community that we work with responded to this trend of outsourcing? We're seeing, you know, some of the family offices that we work with assess the capabilities and assess the fees of the services that they provide versus what's available on the open market to really get a better understanding for this, you know, make versus buy decision. We even had a family that did a complete third-party benchmarking study looking at everything that they did in-house and assuming that they were tomorrow going to outsource everything, and looked at what services they could get, how different would it be from what they were providing the family today, how much would it cost. And what's interesting is, as a result of this study, the family actually decided to keep the single family office because they felt that they were getting a level of customization at a fairly attractive price that they couldn't find elsewhere. And then on the advisor side, we've seen a lot of advisors, you know, take that approach of multiple doors of entry. We will work with a family maybe on a small service component, but obviously with the hope of bringing revenue for the business, but even more importantly, building a relationship with a new family. And some of the advisors that we work with have done that very successfully, starting small and then suddenly taking more and more business away from the single family office and becoming a very important partner to this family. So questions for you to think about. How aware are families today of the outsourced options? Because what we found with the families that we work is one of the reasons why they don't outsource that much or haven't for many years is because they don't really know what's available out there. And it really surprised me initially when it came up in our research. Those families are very sophisticated, they've been very successful, but because single family offices are often designed to protect families and to stay under the radar and to provide a lot of confidentiality, some of those single family offices have lost touch with the outside world and don't always know who is the best provider for such and such services, what are the differences between the different providers out there, how much should you pay for some services. And they find a lot of that support and value from us because we focus on those issues, but in isolation, they sometimes don't even know that you can actually buy this off the shelf from an advisor and get a really good service level that integrates well with what you do, and it's a lot more attractive than doing it yourself. And for you, I don't know how much of this trend is prevalent here in India, but thinking that it could be actually an opportunity for single family offices to be more efficient and effective, and it could be an opportunity for advisors to build relationships with families. If you present yourself and if you understand this ability to supplement what they do and not necessarily replace what they're doing. So next trend, number 4, the fact that advisor firms and single family offices are preparing to fill the human capital gap left by retiring wealth professionals. So that's a very strong trend in the Western world, in Europe definitely, and in the US, where there's a generation of very competent wealth advisors who have a lot of tribal knowledge in their heads about the relationship with the family, about the family dynamic, about the services that they provide with them. And this whole generation is going to retire in the years ahead. So to give you some statistics, this came from a market study that Pershing and BNY Mellon did in the US market. The average age of advisors today is 50 years old. 25% of advisors will retire in the next 10 years. And that means that 237,000 advisors will be needed to fill the gap in the next 10 years. So those are big numbers, as you can imagine, and challenging, especially given the seniority and the experience and the expertise that's in the heads of those advisors. So the question, though, that comes to mind is, what about the junior advisors? Can they just take over and replace the senior advisors? And it's a bit more complex than that at first glance, because there are only 2 junior advisors in place for every lead advisor. For every 3 lead advisors, sorry. There's an average experience gap of 11 years, which is not insignificant. And even more importantly, there's a very significant skill gap. And what our research has shown is that the perception from the advisory world is that the more junior advisors, number 1, do not have ability to develop new client relationships. So they're not really this business development role yet. And number 2, cannot yet take accountability for the delivery of ongoing advice to clients. So they're good and strong in a support role, they're not quite ready to be in the lead role. And this trend is challenging for a lot of the advisors, as you can imagine. The silver lining, though, is that advances in technology will help address some of those issues through efficiencies, through greater productivity, number 1. There's also, an opportunity in the fact that a different skill set will be required to serve the client of the future. And those new, more junior advisors are a lot more likely to connect with that client of the future and maybe themselves more focused on some of the soft issues which are becoming increasingly important for families. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So it might be, this changing of the guard might be a little bit of an opportunity in disguise. Understanding what the skills of the advisors of the future are going to be is a critical step. And we're seeing a lot of the advisors in our community do that, work on clearly identifying, doing an inventory of the skills that are going to be required to succeed. And also there's a lot of time spent and attention in making sure that through that significant transition from one generation to the next, the client experience is not going to suffer, and making sure that there are seamless transitions being orchestrated is what a lot of advisors are working on. So how has our community responded to this trend? A lot of them think about their organization, their culture, try to identify those skills that I mentioned that are required to succeed with their clients in their environment. We've seen some advisors proactively develop in-house talent in anticipation of retiring advisors, so creating kind of a school within the firm to train people and take them to the next level. We're seeing a lot of focus on onboarding, on mentoring programs where a senior advisor will be matched with a junior advisor and they will work together to transition this knowledge and make sure that all the experience is captured and in the heads of the junior advisors. So a few things for you to think about. How are you in your organizations planning this management of the human capital to address the increasingly sophisticated needs of your clients? What succession planning, is in place as you're seeing some senior advisors retiring or planning to retire in the next 5 to 10 years? And how, as an advisor, are you adapting to a more educated client who's, a more educated client on one hand is a better client, it's an easier client to serve because they know what they want and they understand the value. But it's also sometimes a more challenging client because their expectations have gone up. So trend number 5, the fact that family education and learning are becoming essential service requirements. So this has been a very fundamental shift in the families that we serve, both in Europe and in the US. And we're seeing some of that in Australia also, where we have a good group of members. Education, family education is no longer a nice to have. And I think for a long time, our families talked about focusing on family education, but it was, an hour at the annual family meeting. It was something that wasn't really given a lot of time and attention. What we're seeing now is families are really coming to realize that engagement is the holy grail. You will not preserve the wealth of the family from one generation to the next if the next generation is not engaged. And you can't expect the next generation to get engaged if they don't understand the wealth, if they don't understand the family enterprise. And you can't expect them to understand it if you don't provide some level of education. And education is not, sending them to great schools and business schools, but it's really education about the wealth, about the family, about what does it mean to be a responsible steward of the wealth. And we're seeing that more and more families seek that kind of education. Some of them do it themselves, some of them turn to their advisors for support. And some facts to support what I'm saying is in the feedback survey that we did with our members recently, asking them what programs we should put together for the year ahead, the #1 future program topic was educating the next generation. And then we're also seeing that families, not only talk about it, but act on it. 58% of the families that we serve have a plan to have a family education budget. So to spend real dollars in education and not just talk about it. And the committed families, those that are really engaged, spend in excess of hundreds of thousands of dollars to educate the next generation. And sometimes the next generation can be fairly large. We have multi-generational families where it may be 20, 30 cousins, but really putting together a comprehensive program, sometimes by age group. So we see families having some initial games where they get the cousins together, for example, between, let's say, the age of 7 to 10, and they get them to come up with a cause that they care about, and the family will write a check to support a charity. But that's behind the disguise of just playing together with the cousins. It's really starting to teach them governance, making decision as a group for that generation. And then as they get older, they sometimes get more active, maybe an internship in the family office or in the family business, and maybe ultimately a role in the foundation, or later on in life a role on the board. But being very disciplined about giving them experiences, and along the way the education that's required to understand what it means. A lot of the families that we work with turn to their advisors or expect their advisors to help them do that. And it's something for you to think about, because we've seen some advisors turn this initial challenge into a real opportunity and use that family education as a way to connect with the family at a greater level. So we're seeing the MFOs, multifamily offices, take that seriously. 50% of the MFOs that we work with have a budget for education of their clients. So they're spending actual dollars to train, to educate the families that they serve. That 50% is an average in the network of MFOs that we serve. Some of them are owned by institutions and fairly large, and others are more boutique players. So the 50% is an average actually between an 86% for the institution-owned MFOs, who almost all of them systematically spend money for wealth owner education, versus only a third for the boutique MFOs. But that's also a function of the fact that being smaller, they have less resources. And then we've also seen, we've done some work on state of the art versus state of the industry in wealth management, trying to compare best practices versus common practices, if you will. And state of the art family education was characterized by the families that we surveyed as a consensus that it is an essential responsibility of all stakeholders, and that a well-rounded curriculum was required in 4 dimensions: the family, the business, the finance, and philanthropy. So think of it as not only a service that as an advisor you can charge for, and there's some firms actually that were solely built around this need of family education and provided as courses or consulting services. But it's also a very effective way for advisors to become closer to the families that they work with, really become a trusted advisor that invests time and resources in educating the next generation. And especially with respect to the next generation, a lot of the advisors that we talk to tell us that it's the most effective way to engage with the next generation. Because obviously, as an advisor, if you were the one who educated a family member when they were young on wealth and responsible ownership and what it means and the role they can play, you create a bond, you create a relationship that will last much longer. And takes away a lot of the risk of losing the client when the wealth transitions to the next generation. So providing family education services is something that the family offices that we work with focus on. Some of them have formalized wealth education programs for the family. Some of them have even multi-year programs where when you look at it, it looks like a curriculum from a university, basically. Year 1, you're going to do this. Year 2, year 3, year 4. And then on the advisor side, significant investments in resources. Some firms have hired people to do so. Some firms put together events and hire consultants to help them to really bring those educational services to the families that they work with. So some questions, for you to think about. As a family, what's the outcome if you invest in family education? What value do you get out of it, and how can that help you address some of the challenges that you face? And ultimately, the goal and the feedback that we hear from the families that we talk to is that it increases the chances of keeping the family together. It increases the chances of leading to long-term sustainable wealth. As an advisor, how can you play a part in this dynamic? How can you help families address those needs? As I mentioned, It could be a source of revenue, but it also, and maybe more importantly, could be a great way to strengthen relationships with families and engage the next generation. Some advisors see it as a challenge and shy away from it. Some advisors see it as an opportunity and leverage it as much as they can. So next trend